Well, this one's going to be fun. I am really excited to talk to you guys about 15 albums that I would recommend to anybody that loves prog and wants to consume some music that wouldn't necessarily be prog, but I think you would really dig. These are albums that kind of flirt with the prog tendencies, or they're just albums that I think people might dig if they really like progressive rock music. So without further ado, let's dive in. These aren't in any way, shape, or form any kind of order. They're just, here are 15. So it's not like a worst or a best list. It's just a group of suggestions. So let's dive in. So the first one I want to talk about is Green Day's 21st Century Breakdown. Now, I know a lot of people would be kind of scratching their heads and say, well, shouldn't you be talking about, the other big one, American Idiot? It's got 2 tracks that are, touching and flirting with the 10-minute mark. It's a concept album. It follows a narrative story. But I do feel as though 21st Century Breakdown has a few more really juicy moments, and I feel as though 21st Century Breakdown gets overlooked because of how big American Idiot turned out to be. I actually enjoy 21st Century Breakdown a little bit more, and I think that the songwritingship of the 3 boys playing in a bigger progressive rock concept album, specifically the songwritingship of Billy Joe Armstrong, has matured a lot within 21st Century Breakdown. I think the narrative through line is a little bit more concrete. I think they're distancing themselves a little bit with some of the themes that they tackled with American Idiot, but still grew past them and kind of matured past them and didn't necessarily, take a very optimistic approach to it. But I love the songs. I think there's a lot more bangers on this album. And if you haven't listened to 21st Century Breakdown, I highly recommend it. It is one of my favorite pieces. It is my favorite piece from Green Day. And it's one of my favorite kind of in this pop punk movement. But yeah, if you haven't heard it, give it a spin. I think you might really enjoy it. All right, the next one I want to talk about is The Hazards of Love by Decemberists. The Decemberists are a Portland-based indie band. Right from the get-go, they always infused progressive rock into their more folky indie outlooks. Their first album of Castaways and Cutouts is a full-on masterpiece. If you haven't heard it already, please do so. And the predecessing album to this one being The Island, the song is The Island, it's The Crane Wife, the album, has 2 songs that go well within like the 10 to 15 minute mark. But this took their proggier approach and went full strung into it. It's a full narrative story that I love. It is a beautiful kind of New England, Portland type of fairy tale, very like Brothers Grimm in some cases, with magic and misfits. Love the actual story and the characters on it. What happens and what transpires is heartbreaking. But it's really the music. There's a lot of Hammond B organ. There's a lot of really heavy riffs in this. And it does present itself as a through line of music. Like there's no real stopping between tracks. It just goes from one track to another track to another track. Yeah, I love this album. Give it a spin if you haven't already. All right, we are going somewhere completely different. We're going somewhere that's not even really within the mainstream prog site. And we're going into a soundtrack. And of all soundtracks, we're going into a video game soundtrack. And that is the video game of Subterranea for the Sega Genesis. So we're going to like the mid-90s here. The thing that I love video game soundtracks. It's what I listen to when I used to do a lot of studying. It's a lot of what I used to do when I was reading. It's repetitive enough to keep you engaged, but not so repetitive that you start to lose your mind, essentially. I mean, that's what video game music was designed to do. It was designed to keep you engaged on the task at hand while doing something else. What I really, really enjoy about the Subterranea soundtrack is each section of music wasn't written to loop. It was literally written to follow you throughout the level that you were playing in. And they averaged that most people took anywhere between 7 to 10 minutes to play through a level. And because of that, you have these long stretches of music that never really repeats, but stays within a theme. And I love that idea within a video game soundtrack. And I'm so flabbergasted of why more video games don't utilize this practice, because it never repeats. It always is doing something different. It's always changing, the landscape. Now, it is written in, the 16-bit style of music, so it's very low key in that sense. But man, does it cover a lot of ground. So if you're into video game soundtracks, if you're into soundtracks at all, if you're even into a stranger's type of instrumental music, I really recommend you check it out. I listen to this constantly, especially when I have to do something very repetitive like spreadsheets. I find this is the perfect soundtrack for when I'm doing that. So yeah, give it a spin. I think it'll be a good time. You can find it on YouTube. It's not that hard to track down. Another one that I want to talk about is the Fresh Air series by Manheim Steamroller. Yeah, I freaking love Manheim Steamroller. They were really big in like the mid to late 70s, utilizing very classical techniques within I don't even want to say like a very poppy style of music. Like this was when like Mike Oldfield was really big, and having longer stretches of instrumentation wasn't all that out of the norm. But my favorite one by far is still Fresh Air 5. Now the first Fresh Airs were all about the different seasons. So you started off, I believe, with spring, went to summer, then into fall, and then closed off with winter. The fifth one is the Journey to the Moon, and it actually starts off with an extremely powerful 10 to 15 minute long suite of music. And the sixth one, I believe, is all about like the Greek myths that I really like. The seventh and eighth one, I'm not big fans of. I think Chip kind of lost the through line with what made Fresh Air so special. But Fresh Air 5 and 6 had a full-on symphony with them. And you can't get better than this. It's the whole Journey to the Moon. It deals a lot with outer space in that sense. I love the big, grandiose sounds that we have on here. It's got very emotive style of music, and it conveys so much just through instrumentation. It's basically what a classical composer would do if they were writing popular music of the 70s. So really lush, very grandiose sounds in that case. And yeah, if you like instrumentations and if you like this bigger sounds, utilizing everything from horns to harpsichords to like clarinets and whatnot, you're going to really dig this one without it being, you know, the classical type of music. So really love this if you love build-ups and payoffs, if you love, you know, changing on a dime in terms of narrative storytelling through strictly instrumentations. I think you're really going to dig this. And honestly, you can't go wrong with any of Fresh Air's work, basically from Fresh Air 1 all the way to about Fresh Air 6. Okay, we're going back into the more indie scene. Now we're talking about the Polyphonic Spree. Love the Polyphonic Spree. One of the things that I love about them is the big sound that they're utilizing. You know, something that, yes, really solidified within the 70s. And one of the things that the Polyphonic Spree has is just the multitude of instruments and members in there. Obviously, you have kind of like the one figurehead that, you know, does most of the writing and orchestration and conducting and all that fun stuff. But there's so many different personalities, and the album that I would highly recommend checking out is Together We're Heavy. This track has 2 tracks that are beyond the 8-minute mark, so there's a lot of build-ups, there's a lot of payoffs, very proggy in that sense, but there's also a lot of very quirky tracks on here as well. There's a lot of very hippy, dippy, very sunflower child type of an idea on there. And Together We're Heavy, I think, is the best like iteration of the band, because I feel like after that it started to lose its shine, what made it very special. And before that, it was just a little too raw, just didn't quite find itself. And I feel like Together We're Heavy has just the perfect iteration, very hippie. So again, if you like the hippie aspect of the whole prog rock sphere, if you're, you know, a fan of like Camel or Yes or even Renaissance, you're gonna really dig these guys, specifically with Together We're Heavy. I mean, obviously the amount of band members that are on here is a little bit of a gimmick, but it does pay off in the end, and it doesn't use it as a crutch. So this is a great one if you're looking for a more symphonic, I mean, it's right in the name, Polyphonic Spree, but if you're looking for more of a symphonic style of rock within more of like an indie style of music, I think you should give it a spin. And the 2 bigger tracks are beautiful and great prog pieces. So yeah. So the next one I want to talk about is 3 Worlds, music from Wolfworks by Max Richter. If you're not familiar with Max Richter, he has done so many different soundtracks and scores. This is, for me, the one that really got me interested and got me into Max's work. I love the very like post-rock style of music that he has. It's reminding me of like Mogwai or Explosions in the Sky. The last track on here is almost this 20-minute ambient soundscape that I just love. But the whole album itself goes through so many different emotions and so many different like iterations that it really does like elevate the music overall. The whole thing is a concept of, you know, Virginia Woolf and kind of her works. I think it is one of his best works. If you haven't heard any of Max Richter's stuff, I think this is a perfect starting point. And it has so much of that proggy aspects of longer stretches of music, very experimental in terms of like the neoclassical aspects without just being complete noise. So yeah, if you kind of like this style of music, you can't go wrong with this. So yeah, that's what I've got for that. Okay, if we want to take this even further, the next one that I have is the soundtrack to The Photographer by Philip Glass. Man, Philip Glass really did like revolutionize a lot of the neoclassical musics within the 70s, writing so many different scores and soundtracks for movies. And the one that really put him on the map was The Photographer, and it's this big, grandiose, very art house style. It's very minimalistic. Like, he was the one that really introduced the world to this minimalistic style of music, taking a theme and just repeating it over and over again and then building upon that. It was just revolutionary. Like, I can't think of any word for that. If you haven't heard of Philip Glass's works by now, I mean, I can almost guarantee you have, but if you haven't actually sought out his work, then absolutely go and listen to it. One of my favorites from him is actually the soundtrack and score from The Truman Show. Some of his work off of that soundtrack just makes me weep. And yeah, I think that The Photographer probably distills his best work. So if you haven't heard it by now and you are a fan of more of a like music as art and music as an experimentation of what sounds can do to create different harmonies, different melodies, different presentations of music, you got to listen to The Photographer. It's got so many different pieces. I believe The Photographer is the one. I mean, I was the one that put it on here. It's got so many longer stretches of music going into the 19 and 20 minute mark. Absolutely go and check it out. You'll do yourself a favor. And yeah, I cannot recommend it more. So yeah, that's what I got for it. Okay, next one I want to talk about is one that really shouldn't come as a surprise for very many people. And a lot of people would actually say, well, that is prog, so why would you even keep it on here? But it is a part of the jazz fusion style of music, and that is The Romantic Warrior by Return to Forever. And part of the thing that I love about Return to Forever is just the bandmates of this. You got Stanley Clarke on bass, you got El Demiola on guitars, and you've got Chip Corea on keyboards. And I wish I could tell you off the top of my head who the drummer is. And Lenny White, how could I forget Lenny? Lenny White on the drums. And so, I mean, these four individuals are just masters of their own individual crafts, and each one has a very prolific and very successful solo career. So when you put these four individuals in a room together to create their own band, you know what they're going to be creating is an absolute masterpiece. And each of their albums really are. And the one that I have to start with is one of their later albums, but probably their most well-known, which is The Romantic Warrior. It is jazz fusion at its finest and has so many different techniques of the progressive rock movement in its DNA, like each of their albums do. But this one in particular definitely has a lot of progressive rock on it. And a lot of the prog sphere knows about this album because of that. Like, it's almost as though, you know, the jazz fusion was seeing what like King Crimson and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and all those more eccentric and electric bands were doing, and said, yeah, we can do you one better. You know, it's very much like the Mahavishnu's orchestra in that sense as well. Love these guys. And if you like more of the like avant-garde, very like pushing of boundaries, very like experimentation and very chaotic style of progressive rock, then man, you already know about this and you're already like singing its high praise. But if you haven't heard about Return to Forever and you haven't like dove into their music, start with Romantic Warrior. Really, really great outfit from four brilliant musicians. Okay, next up, man, I have a lot of albums here from the indie scene, but I mean, part of being the, you know, an indie artist is that you're not confining yourself to any predisposed ideas of what music should be, and that in itself is very prog. So we're going to talk about The Reflector by Arcade Fire. I know a lot of people aren't as big of a fan of The Reflector from Arcade Fire as I am. For me, it's their magnum opus. It is their absolute best album. I know for most other people, it's either The Suburbs or Funeral, and those albums are great. You can't get any better than that. But for me, you can, and that's The Reflector. Part of the reason why I love The Reflector is that there are a number of tracks that stretch their legs into a little bit longer stretches of music that allows them to really play out an idea or a theme. I'm loving the overall concept of The Reflector. I'm loving a lot of like how they're playing around with that. I'm loving like so many different tracks on here. Like there's so many notable moments on here in terms of build-ups, of payoffs, of playing around with a theme. For me, it's just an album that I think almost anybody could enjoy. It's a little bit darker for sure, but it never becomes overly melodramatic or overly dour in being dark. But man, I don't know. I love it. It's a great concept album, like all of their albums are. And I think it's one that I think almost anybody can enjoy. Just with the title track of The Reflector that has David Bowie on it, I think it's a great album that I think almost anybody can enjoy. Okay, next up is one that is a little bit more funky, and it's probably the most recent of all these albums, and that is Over the Top by Twerp, or TWRP. The thing that I love about these guys is just how funky their music is. Like their bass lines on all their tracks are just so gorgeous. And Over the Top is probably their best album. I love just how meaty all these tracks are, how really gripping it is. It's just so lush in terms of being quirky, of being off the walls, being a little bit avant-garde, but always accessible. And I mean, that is a little bit of an oxymoron, being avant-garde and accessible, but like Frank Zappa would be playing around with some of these themes and some of these ideas. And I just love that they never completely take themselves seriously. On This Rock is probably my favorite track from 2021. And it was just one that just, I don't know, it was like a really warm hug. So yeah, if you haven't heard Twerp by now, I highly recommend them. If you're looking for something that's very fun and very like funky as well. Funky fun. There you go. There's a good nomiker for Twerp. Yeah, let's move on. All right, I guess we're spending a lot more time over in the indie scene. This is one, an indie darling, if there ever really was one, of Elliott Smith. An individual gone far too soon. And I was debating of which album from him to put on, but I'm going to put on his probably most accessible album, which is Figure 8. It's probably his most well-known one as well. I was very tempted to put his posthumous album of A Fool on the Hill. I think it's The Fool on the Hill. Or Songs from a Forgotten Basement, something like that. But I think that Figure 8 is the one that got me into his music, just with how luscious his singing style is, his poetry, his like almost like analytical perfectionism when it comes to harmonies with himself. I mean, I can't think of anybody else that could harmonize with their own voice as well as he does. Maybe the only person that comes to mind is like Freddie Mercury, but Freddie Mercury did it in a very operatic and very big style of music, whereas Elliott Smith does it in a much more intimate and a much smaller scale. But I love a lot of the tracks off of this. They're so juicy. They're so poignant. And a lot of them are a little bit more low key, like they're not that big style of music, but they emote so much more. So if you're looking for a little bit more of a subdued record, if you're looking for something that's, a little bit more introspective and a little bit more intimate, I highly recommend checking this one out. It's probably one of my favorites of the whole indie movement, especially like a very early indie movement. So yeah. Okay, we're going into something completely different, and this time we're talking about Cardiacs. And a lot of people would, again, say that they're a progressive rock band, but I feel like Cardiacs was born out of the kind of like post-punk movements of like the mid to late 80s, where punk really didn't know what to do, so they were experimenting so much more. And I feel like On Land and On Sea really did take what the punk movement was doing in being very aggressive, very fast-paced, very bombastic, but sophisticated to such an extent that they were blending sounds like Oingo Boingo and, the whole new wave style, like even Devo and maybe even a lot of the krautrock, and just blending it into like this almost unrecognizable sound that still to this day nobody really has come close to, maybe outside of like the full-on like post-hardcore, post-punk bands from like the Mars Volta in that sense. What I particularly love is even though all these tracks, especially on Land and On Sea, is so bombastic and so like raw. It's that ending piece and their ability to emote passion that elevates them onto a whole different skill entirely. Like, even though they're able to be raw and relentless and just bombastic, it's that being able to take a step back and just produce this beautiful, beautiful stretch of music that I don't know, it elevates it into something completely different. And that in its essence is very, very prog. So if you haven't already heard the Cardiacs by now, I am a fanboy of theirs. I will like tout and wave their banner every chance that I get because of how prominent and unfortunately how overlooked they are. So yeah, you got to check them out, and you can't go wrong with And On Land and On Sea. I think it's one of their best works. Okay, I think we're going now into the proggiest prog that I'd ever have progged, and that is the Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky. Man, I mean, people rioted, you know, the Rite of Spring riots were a real thing. This was a man that was very used to pushing the boundaries of what music meant, specifically in the classical movements of the early 1900s. And I think the Rite of Spring is really the essence of what it means to be prog. I love how bombastic this piece is. I also love how chillingly beautiful this piece is as well. I mean, this thing was written as a ballet at first, much like a lot of his pieces, like his other big one, which is the Firebird Suite. But this one was really meant as like this very tribal, but it has been kind of reworked. And I mean, my first iteration of this was Fantasia with all the dinosaurs. And it really does like have this whole Land Before Time aspect and essence of it, with how rhythmic it is, how like horns it is. Like, it's very, very horn heavy. If you love experimentation and music as art, you gotta listen to the Rite of Spring. It is one of my all-time favorite pieces from any artist. And I will just come on and listen to it just to get washed over. I mean, Yes used this album, this piece, as a starting point for a lot of their stuff. I mean, you wouldn't have Tales of Topographic Oceans without the Rite of Spring. You just wouldn't. So yeah, if you haven't heard the Rite of Spring by now, you gotta go ahead and listen to it. If you're a fan of classical music, you gotta listen to it. I freaking love it. So yeah. All right, coming into the final few, the last one of the last ones that I want to talk about is more leaning onto the jazz. And I mean, I already touched a little bit with jazz with, Return to Forever, but the one that I really wanted to elevate is one of my favorite jazz musicians of Miles Davis. I love his work. I have like so many of his records. And there were so many that I could have chosen from, like Bitches Brew and A Kind of Blue are two of his like big prominent albums, but the one that I really wanted to shine the light on the most was In a Silent Way. I love how somber this one is. I love how mellow and melancholical it is without being completely drab. Like, I love how so many different themes are played on here, and I love the jazz movements within the mid to late 60s and early 70s. And Miles Davis, along with like John Coltrane and a lot of other prominent figures, were really testing the boundaries of what jazz meant in this mid to late century. And I love In a Silent Way. I love the more moody aspects and all the different musicians that he has on here to help him out. I believe both Chip Corea as well as Herbie Hancock are found on here. And I love both of those. Like, I was very tempted to put a Herbie Hancock's Headhunter on here just because of how proggy that piece is as well. So that's going to be an honorable mentions. If you haven't heard of Herbie Hancock's Headhunters, go and listen to it. It is just absolutely phenomenal. But back to A Silent Way with Miles Davis. Yeah, I love just how, like, the blueprints to, like, King Crimson's Islands are on here, for sure. Love just how introspective this piece is and how emotive it is. For a purely instrumental jazz album, you know, it's so unbelievably beautiful. So if you haven't listened to this and you love that style of music, go ahead and listen to it, because you're not going to be disappointed. All right, and rounding us all off, I'm sticking to the 70s, and I'm also sticking to an Igor Stravinsky style of music, and that is from Iosa Tomata. Tomata. I can never pronounce his name, and I'm so sorry. And that is The Firebird. He loved to really go in and recontextualize classical pieces with the Moog modular and the MIDI processor. So he would do a lot of synth work with classical pieces, and I think that his best work and his best interpretation was The Firebird. And along with that, he also did Night of Bald Mountain, and I believe the Fawn Suite. So those two tracks kind of encompass the second side of The Firebird. And I loved it. I love the interpretation of this. I love how he took a very proggy classical piece and recontextualized it in the prog sphere with all of these synthesized noises. I mean, this was when like Switched on Bach and Hooked on Classics was really, really big at the time. But they were more of a gimmick, and I feel like this was less a gimmick and much more of a recontextualizing of an already prominent art piece. So if you love like more of a synthwave style of music, you can't go wrong with this one. I think that this one is a fantastic work. And that rounds out my list. Those are 15 non-prog albums that I think prog fans should listen to. What would be your own? I had a little bit of a short list of other albums, but I wasn't too familiar with them. Some of them being like A Thousand Suns from Linkin Park, Me Hungry by King Kong, and To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar. I don't know. I think that you can still listen to those albums, and I think any prog fan would really, really love those ones. But I wanted to stick to 15, and I really enjoyed those 15 albums. So there you go. What other albums do you believe would any prog fan really love? Let me know about those by commenting down below. And what albums have you listened to on this list that you really, really enjoyed? Let me know about those as well by commenting down below. And I hope you really enjoyed this. I wanted to do a little bit more of a longer form stretch of a discussion, and I think I might be doing a little bit more of those moving forwards. And I'm thinking about doing those like every Friday for a little bit. Like I obviously won't be doing it every single Friday, but at least every Friday for a little bit. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that one. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this, give this a big thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel so you don't miss a single video. I've got reviews coming out quite a bit. I'm starting to wrap up my classic albums that I've been reviewing on every Tuesday and Thursday of August, because once September comes, that's it. I'm not doing another one for another year. So I hope you guys have been enjoying that as well. So that's about it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.